I never expected a simple drive to become the stuff of nightmares, but that was before I found myself on that forgotten stretch of highway. The plan had been straightforward: head to Fairbridge for a last-minute work errand, then slip back home before the predicted blizzard grew teeth. By the time I passed the only gas station for miles, the snow was already thickening. Big, heavy flakes collided with the windshield, muting the outside world into a swirling sheet of white. I kept telling myself to stay calm, but my palms stayed clammy on the steering wheel. The wipers groaned with each pass, smearing ice crystals instead of clearing them. At first I held on to a slim hope that the plows would come through, or at least that the storm wouldn't get much worse. Within an hour, that hope died under drifts of snow. Visibility shrank until I could only see a few feet beyond the headlights. Every piece of roadside, signposts, fence lines, melted into a single endless blur. I must have driven another mile or two at a crawl before deciding I was better off stopping. The shoulder was nearly invisible, so I edged over until I felt the tires slip into deeper snow, trusting that meant I wasn't on the main road anymore. I threw the car in park and let the engine idle, hoping it'd keep some semblance of warmth. But it didn't take long before the cold started creeping in. My breath clung to the windshield in hazy patches. Time blurred after that. It felt like I'd been huddled there forever. My phone had maybe 10% battery and, of course, no signal. The worst part was the silence that set in once I finally killed the engine. No passing cars, no plows, not even wind rattling branches. Just the low rumble of the storm pressing down. I grabbed the spare blanket from the back seat and tucked it around my legs, telling myself I'd wait until morning, then try to flag down help. Then came a soft noise against the glass. Maybe sleet, I thought. But sleet doesn't scrape. It was so faint that for a second I doubted I heard anything. When it happened again, a quicker, more deliberate rasp, my pulse kicked into overdrive. I peered through the driver's side window, but the storm was too dense to make out shapes, just shifting shadows. Minutes dragged on, the temperature dipping fast. Ice crystals formed along the base of the windshield, creeping upward. An uneasy feeling gnawed at me. Like the landscape outside wasn't just empty. It felt occupied somehow, even though no headlights approached and no silhouettes loomed near the road. Still, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half certain I'd see something lurching toward me. A cracking sound echoed from under the car, sharp enough to jolt me. Possibly just ice forming beneath the chassis. But it set my nerves on high alert. I gripped the steering wheel, ignoring how stiff my fingers felt, and reminded myself that I just needed to last till daylight. Eventually, the swirling darkness would soften into morning, and I'd have a clear way out. That's what I told myself anyway. In the moment, though, it was hard to feel comforted by any promise of dawn. The storm outside only seemed to deepen, and I couldn't shake the sense that stopping here might have been a dire mistake. One that would keep me pinned in this cold metal box, uncertain what, if anything, was lurking beyond the snow. I'm not sure what woke me first, the sharp bite of the cold or the tapping noise somewhere behind me. My blanket had slipped, and my teeth were chattering. Outside, the wind had shifted to a grating whistle through the side mirrors, as though the storm itself had grown a voice. I tried to convince myself that was the only sound in the dark. Deep down, though, I sensed something else was moving around out there. I twisted around in my seat, focusing on the back window. Everything was a blur of frost and swirling flakes, but the shape of a shadow flickered, a large silhouette passing close, then vanishing again. My stomach went tight. I told myself it could have been a tree limb swaying, but the edges looked too defined. Then came that tapping on the trunk, light, testing, almost like it wanted to check if I was awake. I breathed slow, hugging my arms against my chest. The air inside the car felt thinner, like it was being shared with someone, or something, standing just beyond the doors. A soft scuff came from the driver's side, too deliberate to be random snow shifting. The handle jiggled once, twice. It set off a tiny click from the lock mechanism, and every hair on the back of my neck prickled. A rush of adrenaline flooded through me. I fumbled for the interior light switch, flicking it on out of sheer desperation. The overhead bulb revealed a cramped, frost-smeared interior and plenty of my own terror, but didn't do much to illuminate the storm outside. If whoever was out there saw the light snap on, they might realize I was watching. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. Laughter, but it sounded like a strangled imitation, forced through clenched teeth. My grip tightened on the seat so hard that my fingertips ached. I couldn't pin down where it was coming from, only that it shifted. First near the trunk, then along the passenger side. The laughter rose in pitch and died away, like an abandoned recording cutting out mid-track. I nearly called out, but the words jammed in my throat. A part of me wanted to shout, to scare away whatever lurked out there, but I couldn't even form a full sentence. As if on cue, something heavy scraped across the roof. The car rocked slightly, enough to remind me that if it wanted to, that thing could punch through the glass or tear off a door. Minutes or maybe seconds later, time was a blur. I heard my sister's voice. Only she was living halfway across the country, and definitely not in this snowstorm. Still, it sounded so much like her that my chest constricted. She called me by the old nickname she used when I was little. Her voice was faint, muffled by the storm, as if drifting just outside the passenger door. It couldn't be real. I knew that. Yet it felt so wrong, like the words were borrowed from my memories. The handle on the passenger door popped up, testing the lock. My sister's voice said, "Hey, open up. I'm freezing out here." A wave of dread clutched me, not just because the lock was rattling, but because it sounded almost affectionate. I stared, half expecting the handle to snap off under whatever pressure it was enduring. The door rattled, then went still. For a moment I heard nothing but the wind. The overhead light flickered, a bulb on its last leg, casting jumpy shadows across the seats. Then came a new noise, a raking sound across the side panel, like the tip of a knife or a set of nails. Before I could move, the silhouette was at my driver's window. Its outline nearly filled the frame. Tall, strangely angled limbs that bent in ways my mind struggled to process. I saw what might have been a face, long, slack, with ridges where cheeks should be. It leaned close, and I almost swore I saw breath pluming against the glass. I clamped my mouth shut, trying not to let any sound escape. Despite the adrenaline thundering through me, a sick part of my mind wanted to roll down the window, to see if that really was my sister's voice. To this day, I don't know what stopped me. Maybe a survival instinct, maybe pure shock. After what felt like forever, the shape withdrew. The noise of scraping paws or hooves, impossible to be sure which, faded to one side of the car. My heart hammered so hard my vision blurred. For a second I thought about flinging open the door and running into the storm, but outside was a vast white maze, and that thing was out there too. Staying put seemed marginally safer. Hours bled together. The laughter returned a few times, closer and more brittle. Once, a whisper brushed against the windshield, saying my name in a hushed, sing-song way. I huddled under the blanket and tried not to look whenever a shape slid past the windows. Eventually, in the hush that followed, I realized the storm was beginning to ease. Tiny shards of moonlight broke through the thinning clouds, casting pale streaks over the snow. The interior light dimmed completely, leaving me in darkness. My legs were cramped, my feet numb, but I refused to move. Instead, I watched every direction as best I could, my breath coming in shallow bursts. At some point, a force dropped onto the roof. The metal groaned, pressing down just a few inches over my head. My seatbelt jammed against my chest as I hunched down, waiting for steel to give way. When it didn't, I exhaled shakily. The pressure shifted, sliding toward the trunk, then vanished. My hearing buzzed with the aftershock. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was still there, wandering in the snow, looking for a way in. And it had learned to speak to me in voices I once loved. I must have lost consciousness from the cold and fear. 1 minute, I was wedged against the driver's seat, ears trained on every bump and scrape on the roof. The next, my eyes snapped open to a milky gray dawn. The storm had eased into a whisper of drifting flakes, and a thin light was working its way through the iced windshield. My body felt leaden, as if all the tension of the night had settled deep into my muscles. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it all, the laughter, the rattling door handles, that terrible silhouette. Then I tried to move, and pain shot through my stiff shoulders. The interior of my car was slick with condensation. My breath hung in a low fog. Worse still, my roof was dented inward, a few inches lower than it had been, right where something massive had put its weight. Claw-like gouges stretched across the passenger door in raw lines of paint. Seeing it in the dawn light made my stomach clench. I willed myself to check outside, to confirm the shape had truly gone. The driver's side door resisted at first, ice sealing it shut, but I shouldered it hard until it popped open. A blast of frigid air slammed into me. Snow was up to my knees, drifted in by the night's wind. My breath caught at the sight of my surroundings. Trees bowed under layers of white, fence posts half buried in the distance. The road was little more than a pale scar winding off into emptiness. At first, all was still. No sign of footprints or tracks. Then, as I stumbled around to the back of the car, I found something that stopped me cold. A single line of deep hoof-like impressions, elongated and too far apart to be any ordinary animal. They led away from the trunk to the tree line, then just vanished, as if whatever made them had taken off into the sky. My heart fluttered with a renewed jolt of fear. Despite the daylight, the world felt no safer. I knew I couldn't stay. My phone was nearly dead, and the engine wouldn't start. Every creak or groan of wind had me spinning around, half sure I'd glimpse that elongated face again. So I grabbed the blanket, my phone, and what little gear I had left. Then, with my hood pulled tight, I started walking. The snow swallowed my steps, dragging at my ankles as I forged ahead. Every few yards I had to look behind me, just to make sure nothing was following. The silence was a constant reminder of how alone I was. After what felt like hours, I crested a small slope and spotted a run-down motel and gas station, maybe a quarter-mile away. Relief nearly buckled my legs. I hurried across the lot as fast as the drifts would let me, panting, face numb. Inside the station, a startled clerk gawked at me, then rushed to fetch blankets and coffee. I tried explaining what happened, but words tumbled out in a jumbled mess of something was out there, and it wasn't human. He looked at me the way you'd look at a person spouting ghost stories, but he still dialed the local police. When the authorities showed up, I expected skepticism, or maybe that indulgent nod you give someone who's hysterical. Instead, they listened carefully, especially when they heard about the scratches on the car. 2 officers drove out to investigate, and a few hours later, they returned looking shaken. They didn't offer me a full report, but one muttered something about unidentified prints and fur clumps around the vehicle. I caught the fearful glances they exchanged, like neither wanted to say what they really thought. The rest of the day passed in a blur of formalities. A tow truck collected my battered car. The police advised me to get checked at a clinic for frostbite. Through it all, a single question hissed at the back of my mind. If that thing really just walked away, could it come back? I'm not sure how I made it home. My memories blur after stepping into a heated ambulance. In the days since, I've clung to the stinging memories of that night. The laughter that mimicked loved ones. The impossible silhouette pressed against the window. The single trail of hoofprints burned into the snow. Friends keep telling me I was hallucinating from the cold. Maybe part of me wants to believe that. But I can't forget the damage done to my car, or how the officers seemed rattled by whatever they discovered in the fresh drifts. I share my story now because I need to, in the hopes that it'll finally shake loose the knots in my mind. Believe me or don't. I know it all sounds absurd. But if you ever find yourself traveling roads swallowed by a blizzard, checking that rearview mirror and seeing shapes that just don't make sense, do me a favor. Keep your doors locked and your eyes sharp, because I can't stop feeling like it's still out there, prowling those whiteout highways, waiting for the next person foolish enough to pull over. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I catch myself straining to hear it again. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, convinced the day would start like any other. The coffee tasted a bit stale, but I figured I'd fix a fresh pot once I settled on my front porch. That porch used to be my fortress of calm, the perfect spot in Oak Ridge Valley to watch wind dance across the meadow and swirl into the thick line of elms and birches beyond. On a normal day, I'd hear small creatures rustling through the brush, see crows taking lazy loops in the sky, all of it stitching together a sense of peace. But everything felt strangely locked in place as I stepped outside. No breeze, no hint of movement. Even the usual chatter from the birds was gone, like they'd decided to vanish overnight. My stomach twisted in an odd way, but I forced myself to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired. I settled into my usual seat, propping my binoculars against the rail. I never went out there without them. Animal watching was a habit that always put me at ease. Raising them, I panned over the rolling meadow, scanning for any sign of deer or maybe a fox. At first, nothing looked out of place. The bright morning sun glinted off the tall grass, and a small cluster of wildflowers gave a splash of color near the fence. It was almost relaxing enough to let me forget how weirdly quiet it was. Then I caught a twitch in the trees. Just a flicker of movement. At first, I chalked it up to a trick of light. But this particular branch didn't just sway, it jerked, like something had tugged it. As I brought my binoculars into sharper focus, my pulse bumped. The shape seemed too thin, too pale, and there were no fresh buds like the other branches around it. Its surface looked smooth in places, almost like bleached driftwood that had spent too long under a harsh sun. Leaning forward, I locked onto the eerie branch, expecting it to be nothing more than a weird optical illusion. That hope evaporated the moment I saw other spindly offshoots growing out of it, all equally bare. They stuck up at unnatural angles like skeletal digits. A tiny shiver of alarm rippled through me, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just a dead limb left over from winter, right? Wrong. The limb lifted straight up, defying any kind of breeze. There was none anyway. It rose, then extended sideways, almost gliding. I held my breath, wishing it'd stop. My mind toyed with me, spinning silly images of living trees, but I knew that was nonsense. Only, it sure didn't behave like a normal branch. A voice in my head insisted I tear my eyes away, but I couldn't. My gaze followed the limb to a shape near its end, something warped and elongated. That's when I noticed a smooth curve that looked an awful lot like a horn. Or maybe two horns, sprouting from what appeared to be a skull. No eyes, just two hollow cavities where eyes should be. It angled toward me, as if acknowledging I'd spotted it. My nerves flared in an instant. Without really deciding to move, I was already off my chair and inside, slamming the door behind me. Heart hammering, I snatched my phone from the kitchen table, pressing it tight in my grip. I peeked through the curtains in a panicked blur, expecting to see the yard still empty. Instead, I spotted it in the meadow, out in the open this time. It was massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, and it seemed to glide as it walked. Tattered animal hides covered parts of its frame, but bone was visible underneath, reflecting the sun in an unnerving way. Its bleached skull tilted in my direction, horns branching out like twisted limbs. I felt the unshakable impression it was staring directly at me, even though those sockets were dark. For a moment, my muscles refused to respond. Everything inside me screamed run, but I was frozen. Finally, I forced myself into action, thumb jabbing at the phone's keypad. When the dispatcher answered, my voice came out shaky. I rattled off bits about something in the field, a monstrous shape made of bones and horns, and halfway through, the operator's tone shifted from polite concern to an odd calm, like she'd heard this story before. I almost asked if I'd dialed the right number, but then the call simply dropped. No warning, no crackle of static, just dead silence. Staring at the phone in disbelief, I redialed. Nothing, not even a ring. I glanced at the curtains again, regretting my choice instantly. The creature was moving closer, crossing more of the meadow. My old sedan was parked on the far side of the yard, but if I tried to sprint for it, I doubted I'd even make it halfway before that thing caught me. It almost seemed to relish closing the gap, as if it wanted me to see it coming. A low thud from the front porch jolted me out of my stunned haze. My entire body braced itself as a second impact rocked the door. Dust trickled from the frame, and the hinges groaned under the assault. That door was old, the kind of heavy wood I once thought was secure. A new wave of horror rolled over me when I realized it probably wouldn't hold against this unnatural force. I gripped a kitchen knife on the counter, though how a bit of sharpened steel would help was beyond my imagination. The next strike against the door threatened to rip it from its hinges. My thoughts blurred, fear fueling every frantic breath. Should I hide, run, fight? None of it felt right, but I had maybe seconds to decide. That next collision broke something in the door, sounded like an entire panel caving in. My pulse thundered in my ears. My mind shot through possible exits, or maybe barricades, but the hammering grew louder, more insistent. I pressed my back to the far wall of the hallway, mustering whatever courage I had left. The house seemed way too small now, like there was nowhere safe to go. By the time I heard wood splinter and saw a hint of that pale horror through the crack, I'd already chosen my only real option, the basement. It might buy me time. Maybe it'd lose track of me, or the locked door down there would last a few extra moments. Tightening my hold on the knife, I threw myself down the stairs, not daring to look behind me. The ramming noise thundered again, echoing through the house. My hands scrambled for the basement door handle, yanking it shut. A flimsy lock clicked into place. I stood there in the darkness, shoulders trembling, waiting to see if the door would hold. Above me, the front entrance gave way entirely, letting in something that should not exist, and all I could do was wait. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stood on the basement steps, hand clenched tight around the flimsy lock. The thuds from above left no room to doubt the thing had fully broken through the front door. Every impact jarred the entire frame of my old farmhouse. It was like the house itself shuddered in pain. For a moment, I just froze there, hoping, praying, it might lose interest. No such luck. I heard its weight shift, the floorboards creaking under something impossibly tall. The odor that wafted down, drifting through the gap beneath the door, made my eyes water. Rancid, decaying, but with a strange chemical tang, like sulfur mixed with old rot. A loud crunch echoed from what used to be my living room. It sounded like the remains of a coffee table or maybe one of the chairs. Each crack shredded another piece of my nerves. Finally, I forced my feet to move. The single naked light bulb buzzed overhead, casting shaky shadows along the narrow basement walls. The air down here was stale, tinged with damp earth and rust. There was no easy exit, just a heavy storm hatch that I knew for a fact was barred from the outside. And the slim possibility of calling for help? My phone was in my pocket, but it was useless. No signal got down here, and 911 had already failed me once. At a glance, the basement was a cluttered mess of half-rotted crates and stacks of ancient newspapers. But the hulking shapes of the old furnace and oil tank dominated the room. A decades-old pipe system snaked around them, dripping with condensation. Instinct nudged me to find cover behind the massive tank, because who knew if that door would even slow the creature. I hustled across the room, footsteps echoing, each one a personal betrayal, because they practically announced where I was. My pulse thudded in my ears. As I crouched behind the tank, a deep metallic groan told me the basement door wasn't going to hold. Sure enough, I heard a tortured screech, and a jagged hole splintered through the old wood. My eyes locked on that door. Any second now, it would burst open entirely. Then the footsteps stopped. An eerie hush crept back in, like the house was holding its breath. Seconds ticked by. Maybe it left. Maybe it was tricked by the darkness. I peered around the side of the oil tank, straining to hear the faintest hint of movement. That was when I noticed a wet glistening near the base of the tank, a small puddle of oil that had seeped out around an ancient rag, presumably there to patch a slow leak. My mind flashed an alarm. Flammable. One spark and this place was a tinderbox. A sharp crack yanked me back to reality. The doorknob spun on its axis and clattered to the floor. My chest constricted, every hair on my neck standing on end. Then, with a slow, measured creak, The door gave way, revealing a slice of darkness beyond. Through it slid something pale and gnarled, one long limb ending in fingers or claws of exposed bone. It tapped the wood like it was testing how sturdy the steps were. The shape stooped low, letting me glimpse those twisted horns and that elongated skull. It slithered through the opening, each step a dull thud that pressed dust from the rafters. The basement light cast flickering shadows over it, exposing a rib cage beneath rotted scraps of hide. My heart hammered as it sniffed the air in a disturbingly deliberate way, slow, purposeful, like a beast on the hunt. I realized then it must smell my sweat, my terror. It paused, scanning the cramped basement with those bottomless sockets. I crouched lower behind the tank, trying to steady my uneven breathing. A rivulet of oil snaked along the concrete and under my shoe. The stench grew thicker. If it triggered the furnace pilot light, we'd be in the middle of a firestorm. My lungs tightened. Suddenly, the creature's skull jerked toward me, as though it had finally caught my scent. A ragged hiss escaped its mouth. Before I could think, it lunged against the oil tank. The entire metal cylinder shuddered, pipes rattling in protest. I bit back a cry, inching away from the sloshing liquid. Another slam. The brackets that bolted the tank to the ground squealed in protest. Oil sputtered from the intake valve, spraying the floor. Panic welded my feet to the spot. One more good hit and the tank might tip. Sure enough, the monster pounded again. A deafening clang jolted me so hard I nearly lost my grip on the knife. The tank lurched sideways, tearing free of its brackets. Oil poured out in a fresh torrent, spattering the floor and me. A ring of dark liquid expanded around the base. My eyes darted to the old furnace, half dreading, half expecting the pilot flame to flicker in the corner of my vision. With a horrible inevitability, I heard the furnace click, a whoosh as it cycled on. A spark must have leaped into the oil fumes, because in a heartbeat, orange flames burst along the slick floor, racing toward the thrashing creature. A guttural screech tore from its skeletal jaws, echoing off the walls. Fire coiled up its legs, igniting the rags of fur and hide. In an instant, the basement was a nightmare of swirling flames and choking black smoke. Adrenaline surged, and I scrambled backward, brandishing the knife even though I had no clue how a mere blade would help. The beast flailed, a living torch lurching toward me, swiping at the air with elongated arms. One claw snagged my sleeve, ripping through fabric and raking my flesh. Pain blazed at my side. I staggered backward, tears stinging my eyes from the mix of agony and smoke. Somehow I found my feet and lunged for the stairs. The staircase swayed under each step, and with the basement filling rapidly with acrid smoke, I had to keep low. The creature shrieked behind me, and a burst of sparks shot up as it crashed into the furnace. Sheets of flame blossomed out, burning so hot it singed my hair. I clutched the railing, half blind, and stumbled onto the main floor with a gasp that was equal parts relief and terror. Through the haze I could see my front entry, what was left of it. Flames danced wildly in the basement opening, and blackened bits of debris littered the hallway. Fire crawled up the walls, and the stench of smoke overpowered every other smell. There was no time to plan. I bolted for the front yard, heart galloping in my chest, the sound of that creature's tortured howling locked in my ears. I burst through the shattered doorframe, hacking out coughs, the cool outside air feeling like salvation. The house behind me glowed with flickering firelight, an orange beacon of destruction against the morning sky. My hands trembled, side burning, but I was alive, at least for the moment. I only paused long enough to glance back at the threshold, that sense of dread still clinging to me. Somewhere under the roar of flames, I heard another unearthly shriek echo up from the basement. I didn't wait to see if it would emerge. I staggered into the yard, stumbling toward my car, convinced the nightmare was far from over. The last glimpse I caught of my basement was an inferno devouring everything in its path, and I couldn't shake the sickening certainty that the thing, whatever it was, might yet survive. Escaping the basement felt like coming up for air after nearly drowning. I half collapsed onto the charred remnants of my front porch, lungs scraping for oxygen as a dull roar of flames raged behind me. My side throbbed from the bony swipe the creature had inflicted, and my vision tunneled in and out. I wanted nothing more than to sink to the ground and close my eyes, but dread kept the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Pulling myself together, I staggered across the yard, heading for my dusty sedan parked behind a scraggly oak. The air smelled of smoke and something darker, an acrid, bitter stench clinging to the back of my throat. My keys had to be in my pocket somewhere. My hands shook so violently it took me 2 tries to unlock the driver's side door. A terrified whisper in the back of my head warned me the monster might still be prowling around, possibly scorching alive in the basement or limping through the inferno, something unstoppable. My phone clattered onto the passenger seat, and I slid the keys into the ignition, jamming the pedal the moment the engine caught. Gravel sprayed as I tore away from the farmhouse, every fiber of my being crying out for distance. In the rearview mirror, my once cozy home raged with unholy fire. There were no neighbors to see the glow, nobody for miles. For a heartbeat, I felt a twist of guilt for abandoning everything. Then another burst of flame crackled through a broken window, scattering sparks, and the guilt vanished under raw survival instinct. I drove aimlessly at first, wincing with each bump on the dirt road as pain pulsed in my side. I kept expecting my phone to ring with more cryptic instructions, or maybe that unsettling 911 operator asking me bizarre questions, but the screen stayed dark, indicating zero service. A wave of relief mixed with fear. No help was coming, yet I needed to get patched up before I bled out. Eventually, the road led to the outskirts of Pine Glade, one of those small towns where everyone's known each other for decades, except for recluses like me on farmland. I headed straight for the urgent care clinic. The nurse on duty gasped at my bruised and bloodied state, ordering me onto a gurney while peppering me with questions. I tried explaining what had happened, but every time I stumbled onto the creature made of bones part, I saw her eyes fill with a courteous disbelief. She wrote "possible animal attack" on a note and told me to stay calm, that the sheriff would be in soon. A doctor stitched me up, 8 or 9 stitches, I think, and gave me a sedative. By the time the sheriff showed up, I was floating in a hazy swirl of exhaustion and medication. He wanted details, so I gave him my half-garbled version of the story. Something monstrous, far beyond a mere mountain lion or deranged bear, tore up my house and tried to kill me. Fire consumed everything. The sheriff's face was blank except for a flicker of sympathy. He jotted notes without comment. They released me from the clinic early the next morning. My side felt tender, but stable enough for me to shuffle out under my own power. Just outside the clinic's sliding doors, I spotted a fire truck rumbling past, heading toward Oak Ridge Valley. No siren blaring, just a slow, grim crawl. My stomach dropped, picturing what they might, or might not, find in the blackened wreckage. Had the flames ended that nightmare for good, or was it out there somewhere, still prowling? I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town. The room had a musty odor and threadbare carpet, but at least I wasn't out in the open. After a scalding shower that stung every scratch, I slumped onto the bed and finally let all the pent-up shakes roll through me. I replayed every terrifying second, heart racing like I was still in the thick of it. Unable to sleep, I booted up my phone. The 911 call log was blank, no record of a dropped call. Desperate for an explanation, or maybe just validation, I opened the Reddit app, found a horror-themed forum, and started typing my ordeal in frantic detail. Every battered nerve insisted that no one would believe me, but I had to do it. If there was someone else out there who'd seen something like this, I needed to know. Or maybe I just needed to purge the memory from my system. I spent the night refreshing the page, but exhaustion won. By the time dawn light seeped through the thin curtains, I'd finally drifted off, phone clutched in my hand. When I woke, my notifications tab blinked, loaded with replies. Some comments were jokey or outright dismissive, but a few stood out. One person mentioned an ancient legend of a horned skeleton figure roaming deep forests, haunting those who trespass on certain land. Another user claimed to have spotted something similar near an abandoned mine shaft in a nearby county, attaching a blurry photo of a gangly silhouette by twisted trees. My heartbeat hitched. Even though it was out of focus, there was no mistaking those elongated limbs. For a second, I felt a shred of relief. I wasn't alone in this. The next second brought a fresh wave of dread, thinking about the possibility that thing was still out there. My phone buzzed with a direct message from the user with the photo. They asked if I wanted to go check that mineshaft, maybe gather real proof. I nearly threw the phone across the room. Absolutely not. I grabbed a coffee from the motel lobby, forcing down the stale bitterness while my mind spun. The remnants of my house, and whatever lurked there, were still smoldering in Oak Ridge Valley. The authorities would find nothing but ash and cinders. Part of me itched to go back, to confirm the remains of that monstrosity were scattered among the ruins. The smarter part insisted I leave well enough alone. There was no sense risking my life for closure. Later that afternoon, the sheriff called me with a measured tone, reporting the fire had destroyed everything but the stone foundation. No human remains turned up, no animal carcass either. I hung up, hands quivering. Relief and fear warred in my gut. If the monster died, it left no trace. If it lived, it was invisible now. That night, I packed my car with every possession I had left, which wasn't much. I took the highway toward a friend's place in another state. My side ached with every mile, a dull reminder that something impossible had nearly ended me. Yet I kept going, eyes fixed on the horizon. It wasn't until I crossed the county line that I finally exhaled. A few weeks passed. The wound on my side slowly healed, but my nights stayed restless. Each new evening I checked my Reddit thread, reading stories from people who'd seen vaguely similar beasts or heard tales from older relatives. Maybe half of them were jokes or fictions, but some had too much in common to discount. Over time, fear shifted into a grim understanding. These nightmares weren't as rare as anyone would hope. As the days turned into a makeshift routine, I found a fractured peace. Yes, the memory still lurked, and every creak at night made me twitch, but I was alive to experience those jitters. My old house was gone, but I wasn't. That felt like victory enough for now. I wrote a final update to my Reddit post, thanking everyone who believed me, warning others to trust their instincts, to run if something feels off in the woods or the lonely backroads. Then I closed the laptop, stepping away with a sense that I'd done what I could. I might never prove the creature's existence to the world, but I didn't have to. I'd done my part, staying alive and telling the story. If it was out there, it wouldn't catch me again, and somehow that was enough. I used to think life was predictable, that if I kept a routine, stayed alert, nothing truly sinister could blindside me. Turns out I was wrong. One moment, I was juggling laundry tickets and groceries outside a bland corner shop. The next, I was fading into forced sleep at the hands of a stranger. Everything else blurred. Now, I'm here, in a cellar that stinks of mold and stagnant water, trying to remember how I got trapped in this concrete tomb. If I could replay those final seconds of my normal life, I'd try to spot the moment everything went sideways. Was it the second I rummaged in my purse for the laundry receipt? When I realized I'd left my wallet in the car. Something so trivial, yet it opened the door for him. I recall a rustling behind me, a sudden clamp across my face, and a prickling sensation deep in my shoulder. My mind flared white-hot, like a fuse snapping. I can't recall if I screamed. Maybe I did. Maybe I just froze in place, my body refusing to cooperate. Darkness swallowed me long before any actual night fell outside. When I woke, I was alone. No city sounds, no voices, not even the hum of traffic. It felt like the world had evaporated into a vast emptiness. That was the first hint I wasn't in some typical basement. Everything about the air, the silence, oppressive and stale, suggested I'd been taken far away. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, but the grit under my palms and the ache in my shoulder told me it was real. I forced my eyes open. The dim overhead light flickered like it was powered by a dying generator. Its weak glow revealed a low ceiling and cracked walls, slick with moisture. My wrists were bound, the rope digging so tight that every pulse of blood reminded me I was still alive. My legs were free, which at first struck me as odd. Then I realized he probably didn't need to restrain my legs. The locked steel door across the room was enough. Something about that door kept catching my attention. It looked heavy, reinforced, like it had been there for decades. A dark slot near the bottom hinted that maybe it was used for sliding in food or waste. I tried crawling toward it, but my body felt leaden, every muscle trembling from sedation. After a few grueling minutes, I managed to stand, leaning against the wall. The door didn't budge when I tested it. I started to panic, chest tightening, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. If I collapsed into hysteria, I'd never think clearly. That's when I heard it. Soft footsteps above me. I steadied myself, waiting for something, anything. A voice maybe, but the steps halted abruptly. Then silence. A drop of water fell from somewhere overhead, landing on the back of my neck, making me jump. Each droplet in that place felt like a countdown. My second day in the cellar, I discovered the caretaker's idea of hospitality. A metal dish with limp peas and half-raw rice was shoved through the slot, along with a plastic bottle of water. Not enough to fill me, but enough to keep me alive. I devoured it anyway, every bite tasting of dust. He never showed his face the first few days, but I knew he was listening, because the moment I'd mutter for help or whimper too loudly, I'd hear sudden, heavy footsteps overhead, almost a warning to keep quiet. When I obeyed, the footsteps receded. That started an awful pattern. I'd wake to the flickering light, eat the miserable food, pace the perimeter of the cellar until I was exhausted, then slump against the damp concrete to wait for tomorrow. One night the bulb went out entirely, plunging me into blackness so absolute I thought I'd lost my vision. Minutes dragged into hours. In that darkness, I became aware of every sound. My breathing, the drip of water, faint scratching somewhere behind the walls. I imagined rodents, or maybe other captives, though it was probably just the building settling. My paranoia skyrocketed. I kept thinking I heard whispering on the other side of the door, like he was pressing his ear against it, savoring every sign of my fear. Eventually, the light flickered back on, as if he'd decided I'd spent enough time in the dark. That was the first moment I realized how much power he had over me, not just physically, but mentally. He controlled when I saw light, when I ate, when I slept. It made me furious and terrified all at once. As days passed, I became hyper-focused on my surroundings. I noticed faint scratches near the corners of the floor, like someone had tried to dig out the mortar between the bricks. Another time, I found a broken fingernail embedded in a seam of the wall, a tiny relic of a desperate struggle. These clues told me I wasn't the first, and that thought, it sunk into my chest like a lead weight. Someone else had been here. Maybe multiple someones. The caretaker, though I hadn't labeled him that yet, had a system, refined through practice. I began spotting inconsistent details, a battered bucket in the far corner that served as a bathroom, discolored in ways that suggested it had been used countless times. Faint footprints on the concrete, smaller than my own, trailing from the door to the darkest corner of the cellar. Occasionally, a frigid draft would trickle in through cracks near the ceiling, carrying with it the scent of rotting wood or old chemicals, fueling my speculation about what kind of place he was keeping me in. Yet, he remained silent. He never rushed in with threats or brandished a weapon. Instead, he let the cellar itself break me down. The waiting, the lack of human connection, the rationed food, the flickering lights, it was torture in slow motion. I tried occupying my mind by reciting anything I could remember. Song lyrics, random poetry from high school, grocery lists. The more I fought to hang on to who I was before, the more I realized I was losing track of it. Time blurred. Hours melted into days, or maybe weeks. The caretaker kept me off balance, playing with the light and the tiny ration slot as if the whole process was some twisted experiment. Eventually, I caught a glimpse of him, or part of him. I'd fallen asleep, leaning against the wall. At some point in the night, the door creaked open and I jolted awake. My wrists, still bound by rope, made it impossible to shield my eyes from the sudden glare of a flashlight pointed at my face. I barely saw more than an outline, tall, wearing a hooded coat, gloves on both hands. Something about him was coldly precise, like he was all angles and edges. He didn't speak at first. The only thing I heard was the scratch of pen on paper. Was he taking notes on my reaction, my posture, my fear? Eventually, he stepped closer, enough that I could smell disinfectant on him. I forced myself not to recoil, though every instinct urged me to crawl backward. The caretaker knelt down, shining the light into my eyes, as though assessing me like a doctor would. "You're doing well," he said finally, almost in a whisper. "So far, at least." Then he stood up and turned away, leaving the door ajar. For a fraction of a second, I considered lunging after him, but my legs were trembling, still half asleep, and I couldn't get the rope around my wrists free in time. He vanished into the hallway, and the door swung shut with a heavy clang. The lock clicked, sealing me back into my world of stale air. I spent the rest of the night mentally replaying that split-second encounter. His voice was steady, but I heard a tightness in it, like he was trying not to betray any emotion. It unnerved me more than open rage would have. At least anger comes with a reason. This was different, like he was performing an experiment he expected me to fail. The next few days, I became obsessed with the scraps of evidence left by past captives. I counted the tally marks carved into the concrete near the bucket. 13 sets, each with 5 lines, plus a few incomplete ones. That might mean days, or weeks, or something else entirely. Did that person die here? Did they escape? I traced one of the carvings with my fingernail, accidentally slicing my own skin on the jagged edge. It bled, not too badly, but enough to drip onto the floor. I stared at that bright red stain, imagining how many others had done the same. A wave of dread nearly made me collapse. What if I was just the next poor soul doomed to scratch hopeless marks until my final breath? That evening, the caretaker slid another meal through the slot, but as I crawled to retrieve it, I noticed something new. A scrap of paper folded beneath the dish. I snatched it up, heart pounding. The paper read, "Stay calm, don't fight. Survival depends on obedience." It wasn't his handwriting. This was far too shaky. The words pressed so hard that the pen nearly ripped the page. Another prisoner had tried to warn me, or maybe the caretaker left it there to manipulate me. Either possibility was awful. By now, I'd lost track of how many days I'd been locked in that cellar. My body was weak, but my senses were razor sharp, honed by sheer desperation. Every noise upstairs jolted me awake. The caretaker's footsteps became a twisted lullaby, the only signal that the world above still existed. Sometimes I could swear I heard him talking to himself, or maybe speaking on a phone, but I couldn't make out any words. The minute I focused too hard, the murmur faded. As terrorizing as it was, a spark of stubborn will grew inside me each time he let me taste another day. I refused to dissolve into the oblivion he wanted me to. I'd catch myself whispering old memories, places I'd visited, faces of people I loved. Some were half gone, slippery fragments that made my eyes sting with tears. The caretaker wanted to erase me, reduce me to a nameless body under his control. I wouldn't let him win so easily. One night, after hours of silent darkness, a new sound drifted through the cellar, quiet sobbing. At first, I thought it was an echo of my own distress, but as I listened, it became clear the crying was distinct. Someone else in another room, maybe deeper in this basement. The realization that I wasn't alone in this labyrinth turned my terror into a twisted kind of hope. If there was another captive, perhaps together we could find a way out, or at least share the burden of survival. Yet I never heard that voice again. In the days that followed, I tried tapping on the walls, but no response came. The caretaker, of course, must have known what I was doing. He started stomping on the floor above me whenever I knocked, a silent command to stop. Eventually, I gave in. Day by day, I could feel him drawing closer, increasing his visits, scribbling on his notepad whenever he came in. He made more direct comments about how I was adjusting, that I had potential, but he never elaborated, leaving me in a constant state of uneasy speculation. My mind ran wild with possibilities. Was he planning to sell me, kill me, or use me in some unthinkable experiment? This question gnawed at me relentlessly. The caretaker's calm, methodical approach was worse than any frantic assault. He was patient, confident. He knew the cellar would do half his work for him, and it was working. My strength was fading, my sense of reality unraveling. Still, I held on to one sliver of defiance. I was alive. I was aware. And if I had even the smallest chance, I'd claw my way out of his grip. Maybe that stubborn core was the only thing keeping me from collapsing into the submission he craved. At the end of what felt like an endless streak of days, I caught sight of something glinting under the door. A tiny shard of glass, probably from a broken bottle. I hesitated, glancing around as if expecting him to burst in at any second. My body ached in protest, but my desperation outweighed the pain. I crawled over, picked it up with trembling fingers, and hid it in the pocket of my tattered pants. It wasn't much, just a jagged piece of glass that could easily cut me if I wasn't careful. But it was hope, a tiny advantage in a place designed to strip me of all power. Clutching that shard against my palm, I promised myself I'd find a way out, or die trying. This caretaker, whoever he was, wouldn't have the final say on my fate. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped in a steady, unending rhythm, my personal metronome counting the seconds of my captivity. But for the first time since I woke in this nightmare, I allowed a faint spark of determination to warm my chest. This wasn't over. I was still breathing, still thinking. And as long as that continued, my story had a chance to break free from the cellar's suffocating darkness. I used to cling to the idea that I could fight my way out with sheer willpower. That shard of glass I'd hidden at the end of what I'd come to call my first chapter in the cellar felt like a lifeline. Tangible proof I could still make choices. But as time dragged on, and the caretaker began to tighten his grip, the glass started to feel more like a loaded gun with no bullets. The more he learned about me, the harder it became to find any moment of privacy, let alone attempt an escape. The caretaker began to watch me with a clinical fascination, as if I were a lab rat scurrying in his maze. At first it was small changes. He'd replace the flickering bulb with a new one that burned steady, forcing me to track time more accurately. And then he started new tasks, under the guise of helping me regain my strength. I was never sure if he was testing my endurance or my obedience. He introduced a battered exercise mat, padded but smelly, stained by who knows what, and ordered me to perform stretches and push-ups. My arms were trembling from malnourishment, and I could hardly manage more than a few. When I collapsed, the caretaker simply nodded, scribbled something on his ever-present notepad, then left. It felt clinical, like he was logging data. Sometimes, it went beyond physical endurance. One morning, I awoke to a new addition, a dusty old typewriter perched on a flimsy table. Beside it lay pages of text, medical journals, scientific articles, even a chunk of a psychology textbook. My task? Transcribe them word for word. If I misspelled anything, he'd withhold food. The caretaker would glance over my shoulder now and then, tapping his foot impatiently if I slowed down. I started to suspect he was forcing me to memorize these obscure passages. Maybe because it amused him, or perhaps it served some twisted experiment. Still, I did as I was told. Every keystroke felt like a countdown, each sentence pressing me further under his thumb. Part of me wanted to rebel, type nonsense until the ribbons dried out, but I didn't have the nerve to face the consequences. Hunger and darkness had their claws in me, and survival trumped pride. During these sessions, he was eerily calm. No yelling, no threats beyond the implied punishments if I failed. It was like I was an object to be trained, a data point he could mold at will. And each day, his devotion to logging my progress grew. A slip of the tongue or a misspelled word, he'd note it. A moment where I resisted reading certain lines, he'd circle it in red ink. By the end of the second week of these activities, I felt my sense of self evaporating. Just when I thought I couldn't take another day of his cold examinations, the caretaker would pull a 180, showing an unnerving softness. Once, I woke up with a raging fever, my face burning, body drenched in sweat. My head felt like it was cracking open from the inside. I braced for the worst. Instead, he knelt beside me with a damp cloth, pressed it gently against my forehead, and whispered something that almost sounded like concern. "You need fluids," he said, voice low. Then he placed a canteen near my lips. Real water, cool, refreshing. For a moment it felt like mercy, but there was nothing benevolent about it. I remember the ghost of a smirk curving on his mouth as he watched me gulp, like he was pleased with how quickly I'd depend on him for relief. Then he gently peeled back my sweat-soaked hair and said, "You can't fall apart yet, not until you've reached your potential." That sentence sent chills straight through my fever. The idea that he had some master plan, that my suffering was far from random, terrified me more than any beating would have. I spent the rest of that feverish night thinking about what potential meant to someone who kept a prison cell in his basement. In another instance, he offered me a threadbare sweater on a particularly cold morning. My lips were almost blue from shivering, and I half expected him to sneer at my weakness. Instead, he draped the sweater around my shoulders, gave me a fleeting pat, then left without a word. I was sure it was a setup, but as the minutes passed and no punishment came, I dared to feel warmth that wasn't purely physical. Yet even that fleeting kindness curdled into dread. He was caring for me like a farmer tending livestock, just enough to keep me from dying. I'd lost count of how many days it had been since he first commanded me to do those exercises. The cellar felt both smaller and more suffocating each time he came. I'd hear him approach through the hallway, methodical footsteps that halted just long enough to make me doubt whether he was coming in or turning away. There were nights he barely checked on me. Then all of a sudden, he'd flood my cell with his presence for hours. On one of those nights, he slammed the door open, not even bothering with his usual measured composure. He was panting, eyes darting around like a cornered animal. Immediately I picked up on it. He was afraid. I didn't know who or what could scare someone like him, but if he was spooked, it couldn't be good news for me. He rummaged through the tools scattered along the wall. A bent crowbar, a frayed coil of rope, a stained hammer. My heart hammered in my ears, but I forced myself to appear calm. He wouldn't make eye contact, which was almost more unsettling than his usual stony stare. For a second, he looked like he wanted to speak, but swallowed whatever words he'd formed. I caught a glimpse of something else in his gloved hand, a yellowed folder stuffed with papers. He gripped it as though it was crucial to him, a lifeline. Without warning, he grabbed my arm. I started to protest, but his grip was iron tight. He whipped out a syringe, similar to the one I remembered from my abduction, and plunged it into my arm before I could jerk away. Hot panic surged through me. Pain and a sudden numbness cascaded up my shoulder. I felt my consciousness slipping. My last clear memory of that moment was his face, cold sweat gleaming at his temple, a grim set to his jaw. Then darkness swallowed me. I woke to a throbbing headache and a chill in the air that cut right to my bones. Gone were the clammy concrete walls and the single dim light bulb. Instead, I found myself staring at wooden beams overhead, dusty with neglect. A small window, broken in one corner, let in a weak stream of pale dawn. Shivering, I pushed myself upright and realized I was in what looked like an abandoned cottage. The floor was littered with dried leaves and bits of glass, the walls peeled of paint. My right ankle was chained to an old radiator. The caretaker wasn't in sight. My head swam, either from sedation or the shock of new surroundings. The strangest part, unlike the cellar, the door to this room stood ajar. Through it, I could see an empty hallway leading to a back entrance. Overgrown grass poked inside, where the door was broken off its hinges. This place felt unplanned, like he'd moved me in a hurry without time to prep. Why else would he leave a half-busted window and a door that wouldn't fully close? I tested the chain on my ankle, hoping it was as haphazard as the rest of the setup. It was solid, though, attached to a thick metal ring bolted into the radiator. A wave of desperation hit me, so close to potential freedom, and yet still bound. No sign of the caretaker, no sign of the folder or the syringe. Just me, my throbbing arm, and the new prison that might be less secure, but was no less terrifying. A rustle outside made my heart skip. I strained to see if it was him returning, but all I glimpsed were gnarled apple trees in the morning haze, branches twisting in jagged shapes. An orchard, maybe. Something about the neglected rows of trees felt haunted, like I was gazing into the skeleton of someone's failed dream. I scanned the cottage for anything that might help. A toppled chair by the fireplace, an empty bookshelf, a shattered lantern. Then I noticed fresh footprints on the dusty floor. One set belonged to me, barefoot and stumbling, clear from where I'd collapsed. Another set trailed deeper into the house, leading away from the door. Was the caretaker still here, rummaging around for something? Or had he fled? I tugged at the chain a second time. The radiator creaked, but it didn't budge. My hands were free now, though. He'd removed the rope from my wrists, either by negligence or because he knew the chain was enough. I was exhausted, half-drugged, but the seeds of defiance that had taken root back in the cellar still lived in me. I wasn't just going to wait for him to return and drag me to whatever fresh horror he'd planned. Gathering what little strength remained, I forced myself to stand, leaning on the radiator for balance. My mind raced with questions. Why move me here of all places? What was he afraid of? And most pressing, could I escape before he came back? I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, staring through the broken window at the pale early morning sky. A strange mixture of hope and dread filled me. On one hand, this was the first time in ages I'd seen daylight, real daylight, and breathed air that wasn't thick with mold. On the other, my captor was still out there, possibly closer than I realized, and for all I knew, this cottage was just another stage in his grand experiment. But a flicker of possibility ignited. If he was careless enough to leave windows shattered and doors ajar, maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to get away. Or at least to get help. I had no idea how far we were from civilization. I had no idea if he had backup. But I refused to let the caretaker's grip suffocate me any longer. Outside, a breeze rustled through the orchard, making the branches groan like old bones. I swallowed, closed my eyes for a moment, and steadied my breath. Then, tightening my fists, I began testing the radiator bolts in earnest, determined to break free. Because if the caretaker had taught me anything, it was this. As long as I was alive, I had a shot at outlasting him, and maybe even stopping him before he moved on to someone else. I had no clue what the next hours would bring, whether I'd find a path back to the real world, or sink deeper into his nightmarish plan. But for the first time in months, I could feel the sun on my skin. And despite the chain rattling at my ankle, that fleeting brush of warmth reminded me I still had a sliver of hope left to fight for. The afternoon sun stung my eyes as I stumbled out of that orchard cottage, half collapsing into the shocked arms of a middle-aged farmer. He'd heard glass shatter and came to investigate. He didn't expect to find me, skin bruised, eyes hollow, an ankle chain dangling from my foot. All I remember is his face blanching like he'd walked straight into a ghost story. It took him a moment to process the scene before helping me limp away from my makeshift cell. That was the day I finally escaped, or more accurately, the day the caretaker abandoned me. Either way, I was free, for a moment at least. I woke up in a hospital bed a few hours later, drifting in and out of consciousness. The sterile smell of disinfectant burned my nostrils, the fluorescent lights harsh and uncaring. Nurses hovered around, threading IV lines and whispering words like dehydration, severe malnutrition, and trauma. I'd have felt gratitude if I hadn't been so hollowed out. Even a safe clinical environment felt menacing after everything I'd been through. Detective Mills introduced herself the moment I was lucid enough to speak. She was tall, composed, her warm hazel eyes the only softness in a face chiseled by years of police work. She spoke gently, but her questions were pointed. "What's your name? Do you remember where he took you? Did you see his face?" With every inquiry, she strained to keep a reassuring tone, knowing how fragile I was. But I felt more frustration than relief. My memories were like puzzle pieces submerged in murky water. I could picture the caretaker's gloved hands, the hush of his voice, the orchard's skeletal rows, but nothing that pinned him down. No distinct face, no license plate, no clue. I heard the disappointment in her voice when I said I couldn't recall the last clear image of him. All I had were scattered impressions, the burn scar on his wrist, his obsession with scribbling notes, the cloying stench of antiseptic. Time in that hospital blurred. I had nightmares whenever I tried to sleep, jolting awake at odd hours. Nurses would rush in, try to calm me. Detective Mills would pop by, offering me small, forced smiles. Some nights, I thought I saw the caretaker's silhouette in the hallway, waiting for the right moment to drag me back. Rationally, I knew he wasn't there, but reason never stood a chance against the lingering terror of captivity. Gradually, though, the medication and rest did their job. I could form clearer sentences, hold conversations without dissolving into sobs. That's when Detective Mills approached, a file tucked under her arm, her expression grim. "We have a lead," she said quietly, flipping through the paperwork. "Another missing persons case. About 20 miles south of that orchard. Kid named Nolan. Vanished 2 weeks ago." My stomach tightened. 2 weeks ago was around the time the caretaker uprooted me from the orchard and dumped me in that abandoned cottage. I felt sick, wondering if he'd moved on to another victim the very moment he decided I wasn't worth keeping anymore. Once I was stable enough to stand without toppling over, Detective Mills transferred me to a safe house. The space was simple: a small kitchen, a couch, 2 bedrooms. The front windows had thick curtains and extra locks. My assigned officer, a sympathetic woman named Officer Jaramillo, did her best to make me comfortable, but I rarely spoke. My mind was miles away, stuck on the caretaker's potential new captive. Sure enough, a week into my stay, Detective Mills knocked on the door with urgent news. A hiker had discovered a makeshift camp near an old logging trail. She didn't say much more, just handed me a set of photos. I flipped through them, heart pounding. Pictures of a dilapidated shack. Inside, the lens captured unsettling details. Makeshift restraints, a grimy mattress with fresh stains, and a plastic bucket that reminded me all too much of my old life in the cellar. One shot showed the caretaker's trademark brand of control. A small desk with scattered papers, each covered in those spidery notes and red-circled words. My skin crawled just looking at it. Then came the worst image. A young man, thin and pale, strapped to a post by his wrists, head slumped forward. His arms bore angry red welts, possibly from repeated injections. The caretaker's MO, if you asked me. The caption read, "Victim found alive, semi-conscious." My eyes welled with tears, part horror, part relief. He was still breathing. Detective Mills's voice drew me back. "He's in the hospital now, on oxygen and sedatives, but he's stable." She paused. "He mentioned you." My heart almost stopped. "Me?" "Yes." He said the caretaker kept telling him, "Sarah's a success story. You'll be my new project if she disappoints me again." Mills wet her lips, a flicker of anger in her eyes. "He's obsessed with you. It's like you're his proof of concept or something." A cold dread took root in my spine. The caretaker was using me as an example for new captives, fueling their terror by implying I was complicit somehow, or that I'd become part of his twisted designs. But if that poor kid had found the courage to mention me, maybe I could return the favor and help put a stop to this once and for all. I wanted to help. More than anything, I wanted to end this. But Detective Mills was hesitant to involve me further. She insisted I wasn't well enough, that I should rest and let the department handle it. Yet I knew the caretaker too well. His patterns, his manipulations. I could sense that if we didn't act fast, he'd vanish again, leaving more victims in his wake. After hours of pleading, Mills finally relented and allowed me to accompany her team to the site, strictly for observational input. She made me swear I'd stay in the car. Under normal circumstances, I would've, but everything about the caretaker defied normal rules. We drove out in a convoy at dusk, the sun a molten orb on the horizon. My stomach twisted like I was heading back into the orchard cellar. The logging trail was dense with towering pines, the underbrush thick enough to hide a million secrets. Detective Mills led the way, headlights cutting swaths through the dark. When we reached the shack, uniformed officers leapt out, flashlights probing the area. I clenched my teeth, trying not to shiver as memories assaulted me. Then came the shouting. One of the officers burst from behind the shack, yelling, "He's here!" Gunmetal glints in the waning light. I heard branches snapping, frantic footsteps pounding the dirt. My blood froze. Could it really be him? Against my better judgment, I threw open the car door and scrambled out. I had no weapon, no defense, just a swirl of terrified adrenaline. I jogged around the shack, heart hammering. That's when I saw the caretaker's silhouette racing between the trees, the same purposeful stride I recognized from the cellar. Detective Mills and 2 officers tore after him. I should have stayed back, but I couldn't. I dashed through the undergrowth, branches clawing at my arms. The caretaker had a head start, weaving through the pines with unsettling agility, but a fallen log tripped him up. He stumbled. Mills gained ground, shouting for him to freeze. I caught a glimpse of his face, partial, half lit by the flashlight beam. Beneath all that usual composure was raw panic. He pulled something from his coat, a shard of glass maybe, or a tiny blade. Mills barely had time to react. He slashed at her, grazing her arm, then lurched over the log. The officers struggled to maneuver. In the chaos, I locked eyes with him. For a heartbeat, I saw recognition and fury. I think he realized I was the one who'd motivated this chase, that I guided them here. Then, with a guttural hiss, he vanished into the darkness beyond the pines. My vision blurred with tears, breath ragged. Officers scoured the area for half an hour, shining lights and calling out, but the caretaker was gone, as if he'd melted into the forest. Detective Mills cursed under her breath, clutched her wounded arm. I wanted to scream, hating that he'd slipped away again. But as heartbreak threatened to overwhelm me, I remembered something else. We'd found that boy Nolan, alive. We'd raided the caretaker's stronghold, retrieved new evidence, disrupted his sick routine. It was a partial victory, but a victory nonetheless. Back at the safe house, I nursed a cup of chamomile tea, trying to calm the tremors in my hands. Mills sat across from me, a bandage wrapped around her arm. We locked eyes, an unspoken understanding passing between us. We'd wounded him in more ways than one by invading his lair. The caretaker's prize system was compromised, his new victim rescued. He'd be more dangerous now, perhaps, but also more desperate, and more likely to slip up. They say the hospital has transferred Nolan to a secure ward, and he's making slow progress. He's terrified, haunted, but he's also cooperative. Every day he shares a little more about the caretaker's methods, small details that might help the police build a complete profile. Together with my own fragmented memories, the net around this monster is tightening. It's not the neat ending I dreamed of. He's still out there, lurking somewhere, possibly scouting another remote location to rebuild his twisted kingdom. But for the first time, I feel like I've dealt him a real blow. He's not invincible. Detective Mills assured me they'll keep looking. Federal agencies might even join in soon, given the severity and pattern of his crimes. As I settled onto the safe house couch that night, exhaustion pulling at every limb, I stared at the locked door and realized something profound. Despite all the bruises, the night terrors, the overshadowing dread, I am here, I am healing, and I am no longer powerless. The caretaker might still roam the darkness, but he has lost control of me. More importantly, I've helped unravel his secret world, helped to save at least one life from his grasp. I don't know how long it'll take for the nightmares to fade. Maybe they never fully will, but I refuse to let him define me any longer. Detective Mills said there's a good chance we'll catch him soon, and if we do, I plan to stand in that courtroom and tell every detail of what I endured. I'll give his victims a voice. Even if that moment of justice sits on the horizon, I can imagine it now, and imagining it is the first step toward truly living again. Endings aren't always tidy, but this one has something I never thought I'd feel again: hope. We're closing in on him, and I'm finally standing on the right side of the door, free, determined, and ready to take back every lost second. And if he ever tries to come back for me, he'll learn I'm no longer the scared captive in a damp cellar. I've found my voice, my strength, and the caretaker's reign of terror is nearer its end than he ever bargained for.